They called my name right after a woman muttered, I looked like I'd wandered in from the food pantry line. Grace Delaney, 67, retired field nurse. The courthouse lights buzzed overhead, cinnamon drifting up from the cafe below, and that same canvas bag sat at my feet like it always had. Funny how quiet rooms get when the wrong person turns out to be the right one. Ever been sized up before anyone hears your story? Everyone noticed her when she walked in. No one thought she belonged there. Snow flurried in sideways swipes across the courthouse steps, gathering in thin ridges along the railing. The doors groaned as they swung shut behind her. Grace Delaney stood for a breath just inside the entryway, letting the warmth of the radiator lick the damp chill off her coat. Her boots left small, wet half-moons on the tiled floor as she made her way toward the rear bench. A few heads turned. Most turned back. One didn't. It wouldn't be her words that shifted the room. It would be her silence. Brattleboro in early December was the kind of town where everyone's holiday lights went up the weekend after Thanksgiving, and no one dared take them down until the last snowfall in March. The square outside glittered in strands of soft white lights. Inside the courtroom smelled faintly of cinnamon, courtesy of the cafe. Just downstairs, layered under the older scent of pine garland and old paper. It was Civic Hearing Day. Not a big deal. But locals showed up anyway, if only to hear something new. Grace removed her wool cap, tucking a few strands of silver hair behind her ear, and settled onto the wooden bench with a soft creak. She slid a small, spiral-bound notebook from her canvas bag and rested it on her lap. Her fingers knotted, ringless, steady, stayed on the cover. Marshal Gant leaned against the clerk's desk like he owned the grain in the oak. Dressed 3 degrees, too formal for the occasion, crisp tie, polished shoes, hair parted, like a military inspection, was minutes away. He surveyed the room with the suspicion of a man who liked things neat. Grace didn't fit into his mental filing cabinet. He squinted. One of those folks, he muttered to a nearby deputy, not bothering to lower his voice. She looks like she wandered out of the food pantry line, someone whispered in the front row. A woman with frosted lipstick leaned toward her husband, shaking her head just enough to signal pity but not empathy. Grace didn't blink. Her eyes moved across the room, slowly landing on no one but taking everything in. The judge's gavel hadn't even dropped yet, and the room had already passed judgment. Judge Gerald Tannen sat elevated in his chair, glasses low on the bridge of his nose. He flipped through a thin manila folder marked Delaney G., but paused at the 3rd page. Something caught his eye, but only for a moment. He closed the file and nodded toward Marshall. Let's move on. The case today was a minor one. A property line squabble between 2 brothers who shared a fence and never saw eye to eye since they were boys. Grace was listed as a witness, but not a priority. Marshall kept glancing at her, tapping his pen, waiting. The courthouse radiator hissed and rattled like it always did when the weather turned. A snowflake melted lazily on the window pane behind Grace, leaving a thin trail that caught the afternoon light. Her coat, olive green and faded at the seams, hugged her frame. Her canvas bag, frayed at the corner's edges, darkened by time, sat at her feet, like an old dog that had followed her everywhere. "Mornin', ma'am," one of the deputies said as he passed out of habit more than respect. She nodded once, not lifting her gaze. The room's rhythm dragged the way bureaucratic proceedings always do. Someone coughed. A cell phone buzzed and was quickly silenced. The overhead lights flickered once, then held steady. A woman from the cafe downstairs brought up mugs for the judge and Marshall coffee, dark and unadorned. Grace folded her hands atop the notebook, the cover still closed. Her posture was deliberate, as if she had practiced being overlooked. Not slouched, not straight. Just enough to appear comfortable. Just enough to blend in. "Heard she always carries that bag," one man murmured behind his palm. "Even in summer." Marshall cleared his throat. A subtle smirk played at the corner of his mouth. "Ms. Delaney," he called, dragging out the consonants with amused ceremony. "You with us today?" A few snickers rippled through the room. Grace stood slowly. Her knees creaked. She picked up her bag without a word and walked toward the bench. Questions don't need to be cruel to hurt. They only need to be asked with a smile. Grace stood at the front right hand, raised the clerk's voice low, and rehearsed. She swore to tell the truth, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard, and no further. When she sat, her canvas bag rested against the leg of the witness chair, its seams slumping with age. From the gallery, the room watched her not with curiosity, but with expectation, the kind that waited for someone to stumble. Grace had faced harsher storms than this room, but none quite so petty. The lights overhead flickered once. No one looked up, but a few murmured about the wind outside. A whistle curled faintly up from the cafe below. Someone's kettle had reached a boil. The scent of wood polish mixed with cinnamon drifting between rows of tightly crossed arms and poorly hidden stares. Marshall adjusted his tie even though it didn't need adjusting. "Ms. Delaney." He began, his tone almost cordial. "How long have you resided in Brattleboro?" Grace folded her hands in her lap. "Since 1986. He scribbled something on his pad, though no one could see what. "Permanent residence, yes. Alone." There was a pause, not of confusion, but of consideration. "Yes." Marshall smiled gently, a performative thing. "And do you have any formal experience in property surveying, number legal training?" "No." He turned to the judge and let out a short, controlled exhale that wasn't quite a laugh. "Then may I ask, Ms. Delaney, what exactly makes you qualified to testify in a boundary dispute?" A few heads bobbed, subtle nods of validation from people who'd never met her. Grace looked at Marshall, her eyes steady. "I'm familiar with boundary lines. They matter most during a storm." There was a brief silence. Even Judge Tannen blinked, then looked down at the file on his bench. His fingers paused on the edge as if remembering something just out of reach. Marshall cleared his throat. "Right." "But in this context, in any context," Grace interrupted, though her voice never rose, "it's the same. Boundaries protect, or they isolate. Depends who's drawing them." He chuckled, forced. "That's poetic." The tray of cinnamon cookies entered midway through the questioning, carried by a woman from downstairs cafe, her cheeks flushed red from exertion or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. She set it on the side table and quickly left. A few in the gallery reached for them. None were offered to Grace. Evelyn Marston sat stiffly near the back-gloved hands folded over a dark purse. Her gaze never left Grace. Her lips moved slightly, though she spoke to no one. A whisper cut the air behind the third row. "She's probably off the grid. You know the type." Grace said nothing, but her bag shifted a quiet sound as she leaned forward. She opened it slowly and slid a slim file onto her lap. As she did, a folded sheet slipped out, landing lightly on the oak desk before her. The paper bore a faded insignia barely visible but distinct under the soft buzz of the overhead fluorescence. Marshall paused. His brow furrowed faintly, but he kept going. "And this document?" She unfolded it, revealing a header with faded blue ink and a corner marked by a triangular emblem. Judge Tannen leaned forward. "Where did you obtain this document?" His voice had changed, less procedural, more attentive. Grace did not look at him. She placed the paper neatly in front of her, aligning its corners with calm precision. "From a FEMA field kit," she said evenly. "I was part of Task Force 72 Delta. The room stills. Some files collect dust. Others collect silence." Judge Tannen adjusted his glasses and bent toward the document with a care that hadn't marked any other part of the day's proceedings. His eyes scanned the faded heading, then the insignia at the corner. The pages were thin, time-worn, slightly yellowed, yet crisp where folded as though someone had preserved them with intent. She once walked through snow to save strangers. Now strangers looked at her like snow beneath their boots. Outside the courthouse windows, the snow thickened, falling in heavier sheets, now flattening the rooftops and muting the world into a hush. Church bells rang 4 times in the distance, clear, slow chimes that floated through the air like something remembered rather than present. Inside the courtroom had quieted in a way words couldn't explain. The radiator still clanged faintly. Holiday music from the hallway still slipped under the doors. But something in the room had shifted. Grace sat perfectly still, hands folded on her lap, eyes unfocused. A slight tremble passed through her left hand before she stilled it against the wooden armrest. It wasn't nerves. It was memory. Memory had a weight to it, one that no courtroom could measure or file. Marshall opened his mouth as if to speak, closed it, then cleared his throat in frustration. With all due respect, Your Honor, that document is from 2009, a decade ago. Protocol, most likely. Field kits are handed out like candy during emergencies. Judge Tannen didn't look up. His voice came low but sharp. Volunteer Award Operation Delta, Civilian Field Commendation Blizzard Rescue, 2009. He flipped the page. Issued by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, signed by a regional director. She was deployed to the Northeast Corridor during the nor'easter of that year. Task Force 72 Delta. The room exhaled as one, though no one had noticed they'd been holding their breath. From the back, Evelyn Marston slowly stood. Her gloved hands gripped her purse so tightly that her knuckles blanched. Her voice cracked but held. She carried me through the snow, wrapped my feet in her own coat. She looked at Grace, eyes wet. I never knew her name. Gasps, real and unrehearsed, flickered through the crowd. Someone murmured, "That was her." Marshall looked stunned, not indignant, just lost. His file folder hung slack in his hands. Benji, the boy in the back row, shifted forward, rising to a half-stand before slowly straightening. His voice, softer than Evelyn's, reached the center of the room like an ember. She gave me her gloves, he said, and told me not to cry. Grace looked nowhere and everywhere. Her eyes hovered near the judge's bench, but didn't lift to meet his. Her hands, resting now on her thighs, gripped each other gently, not in fear, but in grounding. Her breath came shallow, controlled. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. No one moved. The warmth of the room returned in waves, the faint smell of peppermint cocoa from the lobby, wafting in the closeness of bodies, suddenly no longer leaning away from her, but toward. Judge Tannen straightened. We owe her more than silence. Outside, a camera shutter clicked. Just once. In the back corner, a young woman with a press badge lowered her phone and whispered to her colleague, "That's tomorrow's headline. No sirens, no orders, just snow and one woman who refused to wait." The storm had arrived like a held breath finally exhaled. Bar, Vermont, February 2009. A whiteout before noon, power lines down by 1 and by 2 o'clock. The only sounds were wind and the creaking groans of burdened trees. Roads vanished beneath feet of snow. Church bells stood still, their silence heavier than any chime. Even the plows had retreated, parked under municipal awnings waiting for the worst to pass. But Grace Delaney had never been one for waiting. Grace never wanted her name remembered. But that day she made sure others could be. Inside a FEMA operations tent staked into half-frozen ground, The radio crackled with intermittent static, more a ghost than a message. The field team had been grounded. Junior volunteers sat on overturned bins, sipping tepid coffee and murmuring about how bad things had gotten in Montpelier. When the handheld pinged with a distress blip, no one moved. Grace listened once again, then reached for her coat. "Delaney," one of the younger medics asked. "You sure?" "They said it's gridlocked out past the ridge." "No one's coming if we don't," she said, fastening her headlamp. She pulled rope through the handle of a rolled tarp, tightened her laces, and stepped out into the white. The wind slapped her full in the face, bitter and unforgiving. She lowered her goggles. Trees on either side of the forest road bowed under the weight of ice limbs cracking, sagging toward earth like old men bent in prayer. Grace pressed forward, each step a labor. The radio static was her only compass, no signal bars, just the intermittent buzz and occasional fragmented plea. She walked half a mile before she recognized the curve of the ridge leading to that cabin. The door was buried. A glint of tin showed where the porch had collapsed. Grace dug with her hands. The beam across the entrance was split through the middle, jagged edges crusted in ice. When she broke through, the heat inside was weak and fading. Evelyn lay near the fireplace, pinned under a splintered support beam, one leg bent at an impossible angle. "You came," Evelyn breathed, dazed, face waxy. "You're not dying here," Grace said quietly. Her voice didn't rise. Her calm was colder than the storm outside and twice as steady. Grace assessed the wound, stabilized it with a tourniquet fashioned from her scarf. She found an old axe near the pantry and hacked at the jammed rear door until the hinges buckled. Then she unrolled the tarp and shifted Evelyn slowly, inch by inch, onto the makeshift sled. Evelyn cried out once, then gritted her teeth and nodded. Grace tied the rope across her chest and pulled. The return trek was slower. Her thighs burned. Visibility narrowed to the length of her arm. 200 yards from the cabin, she heard it a cry. Thin, high, almost lost in the wind. She stopped, turned. Nothing but white. Then again, a sound from under a raised porch, half buried. She dropped the rope. There, curled beside a rusted-out heater and a cracked thermos, sat a boy. Maybe 3. Mismatched boots, snot frozen at his lip, his eyes wide, unfocused, but still blinking. Grace knelt. "Hey, little one. You're all right now." His hands were stiff, curled into fists. She slipped off her gloves, warm from her own skin, and wrapped them around his fingers. Then she unzipped her coat and tucked him against her chest, anchoring him between layers, as close to her heartbeat as she could manage. She tied the tarp rope tighter around her waist, one hand holding the boy, the other dragging Evelyn. 3 miles. The soundscape shrank to the crunch of boots, the drag of tarp, the ragged breath she tried not to count. Trees leaned over her path like sentinels. Her headlamp dimmed once. She slapped it. The light returned. An hour passed. Evelyn moaned, then went limp. "Stay with me," Grace murmured. "Don't worry. You'll make it to another Christmas." Her breath frosted the boy's curls, forming crystals on his knit cap. The tents came into view just before she collapsed. Now in the present-day courtroom, the scene was still. Grace sat with the file open in her lap, her eyes lost in a past no one else could see. Her fingertips brushed the edge of her old FEMA ID folded neatly into the last page. A faded photograph, chapped cheeks, snow caught in her hair. Beneath it, her name printed clearly but unspoken for years. She looked down at it for a long moment. Then, with the same deliberate care she had used when wrapping those small hands in her gloves, she folded the ID again and tucked it away. The truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it settles in quietly, like snow on shoulders. Morning came to Brattleboro like a balm, soft and slow. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sugar-dusted town where wreaths hung from every door and lampposts wore garlands like borrowed scarves. A low sun glinted off icy branches and boots crunched freshly shoveled sidewalks. Somewhere in the distance, a bell above a bakery door jingled twice. Grace walked with her scarf pulled high, a thermos of coffee in her gloved hand. She moved like she always did, deliberate, quiet, the kind of presence most people looked past. But today, the people she passed didn't look away. They nodded. Some smiled quickly as if embarrassed. A few murmured, "Morning, ma'am," like they'd been practicing. Grace never looked for attention, but attention found her anyway. She turned onto Main Street and stopped outside Hank's place, the diner tucked between the hardware store and the post office. The sign in the window still blinked open in cheerful red, and the same yellowed menu poster had been taped to the glass for years. She stepped inside. The familiar warmth and scent of frying bacon wrapped around her like an old quilt. Bing Crosby crooned gently from the radio behind the counter, something about sleigh rides and mistletoe. Hank nodded at her from the griddle but didn't speak. Her usual booth by the window was empty, except for a warm cinnamon roll on a ceramic plate and a note tucked under the edge paid by a friend. She sat slowly. The roll steamed fresh. She took a sip from her thermos and looked out the window. Across the street, Marshal Gant sat on a bench outside the town hall, a newspaper folded in his lap. The headline in bold serif, "Local Hero Identified in Courthouse Reveal." He wore no overcoat, only his pressed dress shirt and slumped shoulders. A man temporarily suspended, waiting for more than reinstatement. He caught sight of her, stood awkwardly, and crossed the street. Grace didn't look up until he was at her booth. "I was wrong," he said, voice low. "I let the uniform do the talking." His eyes searched for somewhere to land. "I'm sorry, Miss Delaney." She met his gaze, nodded once, not in forgiveness, but in recognition. Then she picked up her fork and broke the roll gently down the middle. Marshall stood for a beat longer, then walked away. That afternoon, she found mittens on her doorstep. Several pairs neatly arranged. One set had been stitched with the initials QC for the quilting club, and a handwritten tag read, "Warmth from us to you." Grace touched the yarn with her fingertips, then placed the mittens in a woven basket by the door. The wind picked up briefly, carrying the scent of clove from someone's stovetop. A child's laughter echoed down the street. Wood creaked softly under her boots as she stepped inside. Later, Benji appeared, hair windswept, backpack crooked. "My teacher played your story in class," he said, fidgeting. She cried a little. "We all did." "I told them I knew you." Grace opened her door wider, ushered him in for cocoa without words. That evening, as the light dimmed to a soft orange and the air turned brittle with cold, Evelyn Marston stood on Grace's front step, wrapped in a quilted coat, cheeks pink. "You gave me one more Christmas," she said, taking Grace's hand between hers. "Let me give it back." They stood there for a moment, two women bound not by blood, but by weather and will. Grace looked past Evelyn down the lane toward the modest house with the wreath on the door and smoke curling from the chimney. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I'll bring the pie." She never wore medals. But that night, the town wore her story. Christmas Eve draped Brattleboro in gold and hush. The square glowed under a tree strung with white bulbs that blinked slowly like they were breathing. Beneath it, children darted through wool-scarved legs, their blinking necklaces flashing red and green. The choir from Trinity Church hummed the first verse of O Holy Night, voices trembling just slightly in the cold. Wind chimes from nearby porches chimed in agreement. For years they hadn't seen her. Now they'd never forget. Grace stood just behind the crowd, a figure nearly lost in the quiet bustle. Her coat was plain scarf tucked neatly at her neck. She held a paper cup of hot cider that steamed gently against her face. The same canvas bag hung from her shoulder, its frayed strap now looped with a single white ribbon. Snowflakes caught in her silver hair like soft punctuation. Benji stood near the choir, his small hands tucked into thick gloves with tiny initials stitched inside the lining. He looked toward the back row, often scanning, waiting. Evelyn spotted Grace before most did. She moved toward her without hurry, her arm linking with hers, like they'd always belonged in the same frame. "Don't disappear tonight," she whispered. "Let them see you." The mayor spoke briefly beneath the glow of the tree voice carried just far enough. "In this town, we value quiet strength, and tonight we honor a woman who never asked for recognition, but showed us what it means to walk into storms." There was no drum roll, no fanfare, just a shift in breath. Judge Tannen stepped forward, paper in hand. His tone was more intimate than official. In acknowledgement of service given without condition, for hands extended, without hesitation, and for hearts she mended unknowingly, we name the alley behind City Hall Delaney Path. No applause followed. Instead, slowly, one by one, people placed their hands on their chests. Some tilted their heads, some closed their eyes. It was the sound of gratitude made visible. A little girl with a knit red hat approached Grace. Her drawing was clumsy crayon snowflakes, a figure with silver hair standing in front of a swirling white storm. She offered it wordlessly, then ran back to her parents. Grace took the drawing, held it gently in both hands. "I just walked where others were too scared to," she whispered to Evelyn, not for the crowd, but for herself. As if on cue, snow began to fall fine and dry, the kind that hangs mid-air like glitter suspended. Benji reached for Grace's hand, and others began parting, forming a slow arc. Paper lanterns lit from inside lined the walkway toward the alley. The flickering light bounced off brick and snow, tracing a narrow path through the center of town. Grace stepped forward, canvas bag at her side. She didn't hurry. Her boots crunched softly on fresh powder. Children stopped playing to watch. Even the choir fell quiet. Up ahead, Judge Tannen stood with a folded note in his hand, but he didn't extend it. Instead, he simply nodded. Grace passed through them, through memory, misjudgment, rediscovery. Above, stars pushed through the cloud cover like distant lanterns of their own. From behind, someone whispered, "That's the woman with the file." Another voice, quieter still, replied, "No, that's the woman with the heart." On that quiet Christmas Eve, no applause echoed, no spotlight shone, but the hush that fell over the crowd said more than words ever could. Grace Delaney's journey reminded them that kindness often walks in quietly, wearing a coat years old and a bag held together by memory. When we set aside judgment, we begin to see the true weight of a person's story and the silent strength behind it. Like a lantern left glowing on a snowy porch, even the gentlest compassion can light the way home. So perhaps tomorrow, when you pass a stranger on the street, you might look again and see the heart instead of the coat.